Hello, hello. It's a beautiful sunny morning. It's set to be a very hot day. I got up early and I took a walk outside, and I figured this would be a great time to do a video on Laxdaela Saga. Now, Laxdaela Saga is one of the great medieval Icelandic sagas. It was written in the 13th century, as many of these Icelandic sagas, the sagas of the Icelanders, were written. And it concerns events that follow from the 9th century excuse me that follow from the 9th century up until approximately the end of the 11th century. This is the case with many of the Icelandic sagas. Now, Laxdaela Saga is one of the most popular of the Icelandic sagas. There has been a huge proliferation of Icelandic sagas during this time period, during the 13th century. And it's quite interesting as to why this was the case. And after doing some research, I came to a few conclusions of my own. However, that'll be discussed perhaps in another video, perhaps later on in this video. As for this video, it concerns primarily Laxdaela Saga. Now, other than Egil Saga and Njál's Saga, Laxdaela Saga is really one of the foremost Icelandic sagas. And when I say Icelandic sagas, I'm referring to not just sagas that were written in Iceland, but sagas of the Icelanders. These are sagas that concern the Icelandic people. Some Norwegian people as well, but for most part, Icelandic people. So these are not, while for example heroic sagas that concerned many heroic events. Oh my gosh, these crows. The ravens are yapping. That's that is definitely a Norse omen. I can see Odin there. Right there. Okay. So, with the ad-libs and the commentary from our friends of Odin, the Icelandic sagas, the sagas of the Icelanders, are sagas that concern the Icelandic people, and for the most part their genealogy, events that happened throughout this time frame, the 9th to the 11th century, as well as certain things that happened in Norway during this time period, because these are very often interconnected. Also, events that happened in the British Islands. It's not, while heroic sagas were written in Iceland, sagas that concern very legendary events that are not very well documented, events that happened for the most part in Germany. These are not, I'm not referring to these as Icelandic, as these are not Icelander sagas. They're not sagas that concern the Icelandic people, for the most part. Although they do, while they are written about in a legendary manner, they can be applicable in some ways to very often the social and cultural goings-on in which they're written in. And I think that's the case with all literature. There's always a commentary that can be made as to socially and culturally when it was written, how it relates to that, the time period, how it's a sort of reflection of the time period in which it was written. But anyway, enough with the spiel at the start. Laxdaela Saga is one of the more romantic Icelandic sagas. It concerns, for the most part, a love triangle between Gudrun, Osif's daughter, and Boli, as well as, oh my goodness, I'm blanking. Kjartan, that's right. For some reason I was thinking about a different name. Kjartan and Boli. So Kjartan and Boli are foster brothers. And before even these characters come to existence, Kjartan, Boli, and Gudrun, half of the saga concerns their lineage. Concerns other events that happen in Iceland. Because as I mentioned, it's very quite panoramic and a sort of long, it's not a clear, concise story in the sense that it just follows a certain cast of characters. No, this is a story, this is a document, a text that follows centuries. So naturally, these characters' great-great-grandparents are to be mentioned, and they are talked about, and very often they seem to occupy a central role there. That is, their ancestors occupy a central role in the narrative for a long period of the time. For example, one of my favorite characters, Olaf the Peacock, who is Kjartan's father, occupies a central role throughout most of the story, at least until he comes to fruition about 1/3 of a ways into the story. Olaf the Peacock becomes a very important character, and he's a very likable, amicable character. He's a bit ostentatious, at least that's how he got his name, Olaf the Peacock, because he gotta drink some water, because he's always dressed quite finely, quite well, in quite a regal manner, and he has this sort of not exactly a rags to riches story, but a story in which his ancestry and his lineage is doubted, because his father got with his mother and made him. His mother was essentially, at the time it seemed, a slave. Now, slavery is quite a common theme in these Icelandic sagas. During this time period, it was quite prevalent. And slavery would just thraldom would be that you would essentially just take someone, they would work on your land, or they would be your mistress, or whatever the case may be. And Olaf's father took a woman as a slave, but it turns out that this woman was actually, and he had a child with her, who was Olaf, and it turns out this woman actually, would you know, she's actually from royal lineage from Ireland. And there's this whole segment where Olaf has to go and sort of address his grandfather, who's this great Irish king. And his grandfather gives him, I believe, I can't remember if it's a sword, a shield, or a helmet, something like that. Or maybe might be a ring even. No, I think he has to give a ring. A ring is kind of important in that as well. He has to give a ring to his mother's wet nurse or something like that. And there's all kinds of little stories and tangents that these narratives go on, which are interesting, and incredibly interesting. They offer insight into this really alien, foreign world And to me, it's a breath of fresh air and something incredibly unique. Now, how these sagas are written, they have small chapters. The chapters are incredibly short, and they're not very heavy on the descriptions for the most part. There's some parts that are very heavy on the descriptions. But for the most part, it's very streamlined and very fast-paced. You don't get too much insight into characters' minds. Obviously, this is an old book, and that technique only really started coming into play in the late 18th, 19th century. So it's very much a concrete, is what I would describe it, kind of. This is what's happening, very succinct prose. And that goes to the purpose of these sagas. Why were these sagas written? Now, within these sagas, let me just end on Laxdaela Saga. So within these sagas, within Laxdaela Saga, there's a lot of romance, much more romance than the other two sagas that I've read, which are Egil Saga, and actually 3 sagas: Egil Saga, Eric the Red Saga, and the Greenlander Saga. There's quite a lot of romance that comes in play, and it's a very unique type of romance in which the notion of masculinity and being desired as a woman kind of constantly prop up, and how much you're going to show that you desire this. Coughing. How much you desire this person, or Gudrun is the case. Feuds naturally take part and are quite important and quite long-lasting in Laxdaela Saga. So that's another theme to expect in Icelandic sagas. Okay. I'm recovering from a cold. And I'm in that last stage where it's a bit of mucuses coming up. Dreams also are an incredibly important element, and they prop up through prophecies that are to be fulfilled. Now, another interesting part about the Icelandic sagas, as to why these sagas were written, there is an element of legality that is very important within these sagas. And this is something that will strike many readers. There's an element of what is the law, what would brand you as being an outlaw. So essentially, an outlaw would mean that you would not have protection of the chieftain in your area, the chieftain who you swore fealty to. You would not have protection in this area. Essentially, they would not protect you, so you would have to go somewhere else. You are out of the law, so you could be killed or whatever the case may be. And with these people, very often they would have to find a way to escape Iceland and exile themselves. So there is an element of legality in these sagas, and it shows that they were written in a way to create social cohesion through elements of the law. Now, these elements obviously change each time. They change depending on who's in power and who benefits what. But territorial demarcations are very present within these sagas. Who controls what territory? Oh, this person has this valley, this person has this, has around this creek, this stream, this farmstead, they bought this area, or did they buy it legally? Okay, blah blah blah. A lot of that happens in these sagas. So if you enjoy an element of courtroom drama, definitely check out these sagas. There's always also, I've noticed, a subtle element of sort of supernatural that props up every once in a while. Characters being resurrected, and it's very often very subtle. It's just a small thing that happens. It's a small episode, but a character starts to haunt an area. The tension between paganism and Christianity. These sagas were written when Iceland was Christian. Iceland was a Christian country when these sagas were written. However, the pagan practices were still done hush-hush. And there's definitely a condemnation of these pagan practices for the most part. They're seen as witchcraft, which is something that can make you outlawed. But there's also an understanding of these practices, which is quite insightful and interesting. That applies much more to Egil Saga, in my opinion. Another saga that I just recently referenced. Not as much in Laxdaela Saga. There's not as much supernatural things happening, but it still props up every once in a while. Also, some of the bizarre things that happen in these sagas are very, often very comedic and funny. I'm not sure. There must have been, in some way, there are definitely some aspects that may have intentionally been comedic, or maybe they just come across as comedic in how bizarre they are. Like, for example, Gudrun, one of the main characters, the main element, the desired a woman in this love triangle, she divorces her first husband by essentially duping him into wearing women's clothes. So he's wearing women's clothes, and that is grounds to enact a divorce. So women in the Icelandic saga could enact a divorce. They could proceed with divorce. So that was kind of bizarre, and I found that kind of funny, especially the way it was described. But it's not, for the most part, incredibly comedic. It's just that there are little elements of that prop up. Just like there are little elements of the supernatural that prop up. Now, this saga, it's absolutely great. It's a huge contrast to the other saga, the other stories that were coming out of Europe at the time, which were these chivalric sagas. These Europe was becoming almost in a way enthralled by just these chivalric sagas, these sagas about knights going out and doing stuff and courtly love and all of that. So this provides an interesting sort of contrast to these chivalric sagas. Also, in that these chivalric sagas were written, for the most part, they were really written for nobles. So they were written for rich, noble people. These sagas were written for common people. They were written for common people, and it's quite clear that they were written for common people when you research the development of these sagas and why they came to place. It's really to create a sort of identity, not around all of the sagas, but around particular sagas. So to create a sort of regional identity, the people that would live in the Lax River were the people who created this saga, at least the writers that created this saga, because I don't believe it was one writer, but they were attempting to create a cohesive identity that gave certain chieftains legitimacy during the time around this region of the Laxdaela River. And that's for pretty much the most part how many of these sagas came to fruition. It's to give certain chieftains legitimacy for certain regions. That's why these sagas, there's a huge emphasis on geography and territorial and the names of places and things. And they'll often say, that's why this place is called this, and that's so-and-so lived on that farm for many, many years, so-and-so. And there's kind of a subtle element. It seems maybe a bit lost because we're reading it now, but there probably was a subtle element of contemporariness, that while these sagas do go into a sort of legendary history status, where there are legendary things that happen, magical things that happen, during when they were written, the 13th century, they are, although they are, a couple of 100 years old, there is a sort of, it's not the idea of the sagas is not that they were written during the 9th century and that they were written during the 10th century. No, they were written during the 13th century. So there's a certain element that tries to ground it in the 13th century. And when the sagas end, let's say a certain part ends, a section ends that concerns a certain area, they'll say, oh, this person lived in this territory for many, many years. That means that they lived in that territory until the 13th, pretty much until like the present day, for the most part. Or their descendants had the sort of claim to that territory. So that's just another note on the sagas. But great books, incredible. I have to mention also Penguin Classics. There are so many characters within these sagas, but what makes these the Penguin Classics so great? Many other editions have this, but I just find them so easy to navigate. They have a glossary with all the names, so you can see all the names. They've got a few maps as well. They've got chronology also of what happens, and a family tree. Really excellent. So yeah, that's Laxdaela Saga. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care.